Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host today, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Blackout. When you look at this poster, I'm pretty sure a lot of people are going to look at it and think this looks like crap. And I'll be honest with you, it does not do the film justice at all. In fact, this poster is kind of pretty much giving the wrong impression of what the film really is all about. Because when you look at this poster, automatically you're probably thinking that deals with a man, a husband and a wife with their daughter who are being attacked by a bunch of crazy people because during a blackout. That's not really accurate at all. I mean, there's a lot more to the story from what this poster does give the impression as far as what it's all about. And truthfully, I remember when I first saw the poster on, because I saw this movie on Amazon last year for the first time, and I remember thinking, this movie does not look to be very good. It actually looks to be very cheap just based off the poster alone. And then when I saw the movie, I was completely blown away, like how good the movie turned out, and that this poster does not do the film justice at all. It honestly seems like all they did was read this, whoever put the poster together just read the plot synopsis and just thought, all right, we'll just patch a bunch of people together, crop them all up, and then make a poster, make it presentable, and move on with our day. And that's exactly what this poster does look like. One thing I also want to point out too is that this movie is directed by one of my favorite actors of all time in LouisMandylor. I've actually had Louis on my show last year on my show You're So Cool with Rob Medina. And previous to my conversation with him, I did hear that he had talked about being offered to direct this movie, and that he wasn't really so keen on the idea about how people would just lose their shit after 2 days when there's a blackout that occurred, and there's going to be some scarcity as far as food, water, and everything else is concerned. And then when I had my conversation with him on my show, he kind of went more in depth where he had, I think at the time he said he was on a Will Kaufman set of a movie he was shooting with him. And he was on the phone with the producers, and he was like, I'm not really buying the idea that people just lose their shit. Let me think about it some more. Give me some time to think about it, and then I'll get back to you. And then one of the SWAT members that was like one of the advisors, I believe, if I recall correctly, or a police officer that was on the set, had overheard Louis talk to the producers on the phone and say, what's going on? And he said, I'm reading the script. I'm just not really buying the idea of people just going crazy after 2 days if there's a blackout and there's a shortage of food and water. He's like, 2 days? How about 2 hours? He's like, really? He's like, yeah. So the guy went into details about how some people will start losing it the moment they realize there's scarcity when it comes to food and water within hours of a power outage or whatever the case may be. So that guy went into great detail with Louis about how people are fucked up in those type of situations. And Louis is like, holy shit, people are much more psychotic than we anticipate. And he's like, oh yeah, and it can get a lot worse too. So just from that conversation alone, he agreed to go on and take on the project, made some changes along the way to, I guess, more or less fit his aesthetics and more of his sensibilities as far as directing is concerned. And the movie turned out to be beautiful in so many ways here. Now, this movie is kind of considered like a horror film in a horror genre. But when you watch the movie, it is a horror film, but not in the traditional way when you think of a horror movie where there's a monster or there is a man who is out there killing people. It's actually dealing with more about the horrors of the human nature, the human psychosis, and how people just lose their shit when they realize there's scarcity and how they're not prepared to deal with that because they just don't know how to handle themselves under those circumstances. And this movie, I think, does a really good job in showcasing how people are just losing their shit in a short span of time, and the things they're willing to do to survive, whether it means killing their friends or killing somebody they just met, or possibly abandoning somebody along the way too that you would think they would not want to abandon, and just understand the true realities of how people really are under those circumstances. And I think this movie does a really good job in showcasing that and establishing the horror of how people behave under the worst conditions. So with this particular review, I will not get into spoilers because I think the less you know, the better off you'll be when you watch the film progress along the way. Not that there's any sort of surprise ending here. I think in the last couple of reviews, I expressed that same sentiment here, but there really isn't a surprise ending. It's really just about the journey, and then not the shock value, but the understanding of how certain people make decisions along the way, and you understanding what those decisions are and truly understand with who the person is under the worst conditions, but not necessarily side with them, but just get them in under those situations there. And then you're left to decide for yourself whether you can agree with them or not, and understand what the person went through, and truly just think about what you just saw and what had occurred. In a lot of ways, it got me thinking as well too. And not that I don't think the movie is meant to. Well, maybe it was, but it left me a lot to think about how I would actually handle myself under those situations, under the worst conditions. Would I really be as noble as I think I am, or not to say I'm noble, but as a good of a person as I think I am under the worst conditions? Like, would I truly be calm and truly be patient and truly be collected under those circumstances? Because I've seen this movie well over 10 times at this point, and each and every single time I watch the film, I do question myself along the way about how would I handle myself under those situations, and truly being honest with myself, because that's something about this movie I think does a really good job in just showing how the realities of of what people can do under the worst conditions. And you don't necessarily see these acts that are committed in terms of like there's insinuations of rape that occurs, and then the fact that some people are killing children along the way as well too, and just the worst circumstances you can think of. It does occur, but you don't see that. You just see the effects before and after the fact. And I think that the movie does a really good job in just showcasing the brutal realities of that, with actually showing you the actual reality of what occurs in those acts, if you will. So there's so much about this film that I want to get into here, but I'll do my absolute best to try to keep it all condensed. But no spoilers with this review. I'll get into the plot synopsis, the positives, the negatives, and then my rating. In this ensemble thriller, which tells the story of 4 college students, an expected couple, and a lone survivor expert who are confronted by a global blackout that forces them to endure the worst human nature as society falls apart around them. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. My first positive with this film actually has to do with the overall direction of the story, because this movie sits around 90 minutes long, and there's so many different stories going on at once. And the beautiful thing about this particular film that I got to give a lot of credit to Louis for is that you actually have the time to spend with the characters. And although the movie's only 90 minutes long, the amount of time you spend with the characters and getting to know them and understand how they are before this blackout occurs, before things start to get really stressed, or people start stressing out, I should say, you really get to see them in the calm state, if you will. And then as the tension starts to rise and it continues to boil up and it starts to become overwhelming to the point where people start just snapping, then you get to see how people are reacting to those situations where they're shocked and they are surprised to see what's going on, especially when they had no idea what was going on. And then as they're exposed to it, kind of like more or less right in the trenches, if you will, and getting their a visceral reaction about how they're responding to the graphic violence that they're seeing post the acts that have been committed, and then how people are just learning to respond to that, not being exposed to that beforehand, and how everyday people, I should say, really truly do react under those circumstances. And you have a variety of different stories that are crossing paths with each other in some way or shape or form, and you get the various different perspective on those people and how they truly do behave under those circumstances. And the only character that really understands the true nature of people is the actor CostasMandylor, who plays the character of Jim in this movie, who is actually the older brother to director this film, and LouisMandylor, who is phenomenal in this movie. But he's someone that I remember. I was already familiar with who he was before this movie. I've seen several of his movies beforehand, but I was quite surprised to see that he was playing a much older character. And I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I remember the first time I saw this character, I knew he was meant to be an older guy, but when I spoke with Louis on my show, You're So Cool, last year, he said that this guy was meant to be like well into his 70s. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, I didn't buy it because he didn't look like a man who was in his 70s. And then I started looking at, because I had followed Sylvester Stallone on social media, and this guy's well into his 70s at that point. And I remember thinking, this is a man who looks really good for his age, who's gone through a huge amount of injuries, has taken very well care of himself in terms of the physicality is concerned. And he looks a lot better than most guys who are in their 20s, and probably in a lot better shape than most guys in their 20s. So as I went back to watch the film after, my initial critiques about the look of the character, and then seeing Sylvester Stallone, I realized, you know what? I can buy someone who looks that good for someone who's in his 70s and has taken very well care of himself and has been through the trenches, been through war, and truly understands the real nature of human beings when they are in the worst conditions. And he actually does commentate about that as well too. In fact, there's a part of the movie where when the blackout occurs after the first day, if I recall correctly, where the sheriff of this town that where the story has taken focus on, is trying to calm everybody down by letting them know that, hey, we have a guy who works at this power company. He's going to explain to you about what's going on. And then people are starting to get really impatient and losing their shit because, so you're telling us there's no real answer as far as when we can get the power back. And the guy's like, we don't know. We just don't know when we're going to get the power back, but this is what we're doing about it. And people are just losing their shit. And then Costas' character, Jim, starts to interject about, you guys really should be asking the questions about what are you going to do when the people who are not from this town start making their way over here, when they start to look for food, water, room and board, and among other things as well too. What are you going to do about those people who are going to come here by force and be very violent along the way? Because I'm telling you, people are at their worst when they have nothing left to live for, or when they have nothing at all to survive. So the sheriff is like, if and when it happens, we'll talk. He's like, it's already happening. You need to prepare for it now. So there's a clear difference of approach when it comes to someone who knows how people are under the worst conditions, where people who are accustomed to not seeing that tend to behave in a way where like, well, we're not all that bad. And he's like, whoa, no, we're a lot worse. And I think that's what this movie does a really good job in establishing that very, very early on, because as the story progresses along the way, you really get to see some fucked up shit when people are making some horrible choices where you don't necessarily see the violent acts that occur to a degree, but you definitely are, you see the lead up to that and the effects that occur after the fact, where people do some horrible things, where they're killing children, where they're killing people just for the littlest things like food and water, especially when there's actually plenty of it around. But people are also have a large variety of food at their home, but they're not willing to share because they know that people are going to be erratic. They're not going to be collected. They're not going to be respectful. They're not going to be calm about it. They're just going to be very impatient, very just very inconsistent about how they're going to conduct themselves under the worst conditions. But when you watch this movie, you start to realize that if people just had learned to work with each other, all this could have been easily resolved to the point where, in this case, Jim, who had all this stuff prepared, he probably would have been willing to help out other people on the way too, knowing that, hey, the people in this town are good people, so yes, I'm going to help them out. But then he knows that people are fucked up in the head and sees how the reaction of the town is during that town hall meeting, where people are just freaking out and snapping. He's like, I can't trust any of these people here because they're all going to lose their shit, so I got to take care of myself. So it's pretty established early on about what to be expecting with this film. And then as the story progresses along the way, you start to follow the various characters that you follow in this movie and how they go about these situations here, where they are learning to have to adapt very abruptly to the worst scenarios here. And then you also get to see where, as people who are not from the town making their way through and are desperate for food and are desperate for water, desperate for a place to stay. And I think that movie does a good job in establishing that and truly showcasing how people would react under those circumstances in a real life scenario. So I know I kind of went off on a tangent in that particular case here, but I think that this movie does a good job in getting that set up properly and then get the payoff at the end when you see how it all closes out by the end of this movie. One other thing I want to point out to are with all the actors in this movie, and I mean everybody, literally everyone in this film does a really good job in performing in this film and showcasing the strengths that you think they have, and then the vulnerabilities they really do have, and the insecurities they have along the way as well too, and showing some real humanity under those circumstances, where you get to see people who you think are one way and actually are portraying themselves to be something that they're really not, and understanding how people think under those circumstances. And I think all the actors, in my opinion, have done a really good job in showcasing that and truly showing that real performance under the worst conditions that a person can go through under those circumstances, and doing the characters justice in under those circumstances as well too, including the villains in this film. I think everyone does a good job in establishing what the characters' motivations are and understanding where they're coming from, whether you agree with them or not, or if you agree with them as they change along the way, and understand why they make these decisions, and truly just getting a real understanding of what they're going through and who they are under those circumstances. So I know I'm repeating myself in that fashion, but I think you understand what I mean by that. One other thing I want to point out too is with LouisMandylor, the director of this film. He makes a cameo in this movie too, and I won't reveal what the cameo is, but Louis as a director is the same way I think of him as an actor, where you can tell this is a guy who looks at every single aspect of the story and trying to make it a justifiable reason for why it's going to be in the film in the first place. Because one thing about this movie that I truly did appreciate is that there are different things that goes on at the same time with the different stories that we follow here with all these various characters that are in this film. And even though there's one, let's say, what's the best way I could say, one altercation that occurs in one particular story, you get to see that same altercation occur in another story, and how they all kind of coincide with each other because it all happens at the same time. And you really have the time to spend with each of these characters, despite the fact they're all going out at different times and not at the same place. And I think Louis and the editor of this movie have done a really good job in allowing you as an audience member to really get an understanding of what's going on without having to feel like you're being, it's not an inconsistent pace when it comes to that here. So you do have time to truly understand the violence that occurs in this film and the tension that builds up, and it never lets down. And then when you do have time to breathe, you have time to breathe in various ways where you see the distraughtness of what characters are going through when it comes to the fact that they don't have access to the medical things that they need as far as medicine is concerned, or whatever are the injuries they're experiencing here, that they need to get to a hospital, they need to get to a doctor, and having to deal with that along the way too. So you have various forms of those type of stories that we've all seen before in films, but with these different characters, and along the way that you get to see how they're all going about it in different ways, shape, or form, and really understanding under those circumstances what they're going through. And you have the time with the way that I think Louis had directed the film, and how the editor had composited the shots together to really get a full feel of the overall story with everyone that you're following through this film. So I got to give a lot of props to that as well too. And the one thing I also want to point out too about this movie is that this, although this movie, at least I know, I should say, this movie is not a very high budgeted film, but the movie looks beautiful. And what I loved about the film is that it gives it a lot of, that Louis, I think, gives it a lot of scope, and the cinematographer as well too does a good job, and just letting the environment sink in, because it's a beautifully shot film in a beautiful environment, which I think is a big contrast about how I think some people tend to think that the worst of peoples are in the worst condition, are in the worst places too. So like if you think of, in some people's eyes, that some of the worst people comes out of the ghetto, and then when you think of like a mountainside view, you don't think people are that bad. But when you look at this film and you see how people truly behave under the worst conditions, despite the environment that they're in, it doesn't make a difference. So there's a contrast about how beautiful that part of the country looks and how terrible people really are in those environments. So I think that's actually quite a beautiful thing about that film, where you see the contrast of the beautiful environment and shitty people in that environment, if that makes any sense. So a lot of credit to Louis and everyone else in establishing that pretty early on, and seeing how the story progresses along the way in that respect. I think my last positive with this movie that I want to point out does have to do with the fact that, as I said before, this is kind of considered like a horror movie, but it's not your traditional horror film. Because in this movie, it's really about how people behave under the worst conditions, and showing the horrors of how people are under those circumstances. So again, not your traditional horror film, but it is a horror film as far as the genre is concerned, because it does showcase how people are terrible under the worst conditions in a real world setting, which I think I loved about this movie, because it's a real life scenario. Yes, told through the film lenses, if you will, but it makes a lot of sense, where you get to see how terrible people can be under the worst conditions. Because there's plenty of stories that we've all seen before throughout the years, where you have an outage and then there's a riot that occurs, or there's a looting that occurs as well too. And one of the biggest examples of people who are, under the worst conditions, where if you have a major disagreement with people, and whether it be political or religious, or even to some degree just a certain set of family values, there's always some sort of tension that builds up in some way or shape or form. You get stories that are revealed to you, whether it be here in the United States or around the world, and whatever those pockets may be, as far as what those tensions are that are rising there. It could be from a political background, religious background, or just any everyday life background, if you will. And you have people who are just reacting in a visceral way, and sometimes it doesn't have an effect on you directly from where you may be, but when you see that from afar, and seeing how people truly do behave under the worst conditions, or even conditions that could be resolved in a much calmer manner, but somehow it just starts to build up and gets it just escalates from there. This movie, in my opinion, does showcase that in showing how people really do behave. Even when they're in the most nicest environment, they still behave in the worst way too. So that's the reality of how people really can be in under those circumstances. And that's, in a lot of ways, that's what real horror is. And I think to really showcase that in this capacity here. So I think that's the best way I can close up my positive here. So now let's get into my negatives. I had a lot of time to think about what negatives I had about the film. I think the only real negative that I could say that sticks out for me with this movie, because even though I love this movie, it isn't a perfect film, but there's so many great things about this movie that for me, the positives certainly outweigh the negatives by a long, long mile. But if there's only real one negative that I can think of right now that really sticks out for me every single time I watch the movie, is that I wish we had more time with the characters, because although I thought the film does a really good job in establishing who the characters are and knowing their motivations and understanding their background and truly getting to know them as individuals, there were certain moments where I feel like I would like to have more of that fleshed out a little bit more, because I really did like the journey that we were taking with these characters, and I would have liked to spend more time with it, because this movie sits at 90 minutes long. Honestly, an additional 15 minutes probably would have worked a little bit better for the movie to expand on certain details with certain characters along the way, where the way that this film closes out, which I thought was beautiful, but the way the film had closed out, I kind of wanted some more closure with some of the other stories that we got along the way too. Not that it wasn't handled well, it was handled quite well, but I just wanted a bit more of that. So I think that's really the only real negative that I have with the film that I can think of right now. So yeah, that's gonna be the end of my negative. So now let's get into my rating. So as you already know, I do love this movie. I think this is a truly underrated film, done very, very well in various aspects, as far as the directing, the writing by Steve Yeun, also the acting, the cinematography, the editing, the music, the sound quality, all that stuff is really top notch in my opinion when it comes to this particular film. That when you look at the poster, you don't get the impression at all right away, because the poster clearly does not do the film justice. So I hope that people who come across this poster do not get the impression that this is going to be a shitty film, because it is the furthest from that. It's not a perfect film by any means, but it is a very, very well done film in so many ways that I can go on literally for hours about it to point out all the details that I've taken away from that, about what I love about this film, that I think that you guys can certainly take away from when you watch the movie. So for me, I give this movie a solid cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. If you have seen the movie, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. And also, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel. Make sure you share and like our videos, and hit the notification bell while you're down there as well too. And make sure you also follow NRW on social media, on Instagram, New Release Wednesdays, on Facebook, Nerds Rule the World, and on Twitter at the NRW. You can follow me on my social media accounts, on Instagram and Twitter, Mr. Rob Medina, and on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And I have a show on the channel called You're So Cool with Rob Medina, and I have social media for the show as well. On Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina, and on Twitter, You're So Cool WRM. And until next time, everybody, hope you guys have a happy Halloween and stay safe out there, and cheers.